Hello, dear friends, and welcome to the final part 14 of what has been a truly epic whispered read-through of the 70 Great Mysteries of the Ancient World, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. It's been a wonderful journey exploring the historical and archaeological evidence for myths and legends throughout ancient history. If you followed this series to date, please do let me know in the comments below what has been your most interesting element. What's been your favourite episode? What's been your favourite mystery? And of course, if you do enjoy this content and haven't done so, I would greatly appreciate a subscription. You could consider that, of course. I'm never going to tell anyone to subscribe, but I would very much welcome a lovely subscription if you felt that way inclined. Let's jump into the fall of civilizations, and we're going to start off with the Thera eruption and the fall of the Minoans. Now, Thera is Santorini. It has a very special place in my heart. I've been there before, and it's a fascinating place, of course, because the island is around like a moon, a crescent moon, around a caldera or a crater with a volcano in the middle. So Spiridon Marinatos in 1972 posited that the thundering roar must have deafened and terrified the Cretans, who had of course no means of knowing what was its cause. Then must have come the rain of mud and ashes, some cold, some ablaze and burning. Worst of all, however, were the waves which broke over the island, much higher and more rapid than Krakatoa. So the earth tremors had rumbled on for weeks as the crater in the centre of the island spewed ash and lava. Volcanic debris rained down on homes. Thera's farmers abandoned fields and villages and took to their boats and fled. Then, on a summer's day, sometime in the 17th or 16th century BC, the volcano exploded with massive force. The volcanic cone collapsed in stages after the eruption. Dense ash blanketed much of Crete. But did the Thera eruption actually destroy Minoan civilization? So like so many archaeological mysteries, the answer to this puzzle is proving elusive. So Thera, also known as Santorini, is an island in the southern Cyclades group of the Aegean Sea, and it was once around 10 miles in diameter. The ancients called it Calliste, the Beautiful, a precipitous yet fertile island with a volcanic cone rising about 1,600 meters above sea level. The 7,500 megaton explosion, which was greater than the atomic blast at Hiroshima, created 3 islands from one. They surround a 31 square mile caldera, steep cliffs of ash and pumice. Millions of tons of tephra volcanic ash rained down on the island, covering every community under layers of fine dust. And the prevailing northwesterly winds carried the same volcanic ash far over eastern Crete and onto the eastern Mediterranean. Several meters of ash fell on Minoan field systems on Crete, causing havoc with the harvest, and deep sea cores have recovered samples of Santorini ash over an area of more than 300,000 square kilometers, which is 115,800 square miles, and up to 700 kilometers, 430 miles downwind. The grain size in the samples is consistent with ash that could be carried by summer northwesterly winds. Tsunamis may have flowed out from the centre of the eruption. Lesser Santorini eruptions in AD 365 and 1650 created tidal waves that caused severe damage on the north coast of Crete and as far afield as Alexandria in Egypt. An earthquake near Amorgos in 1956 generated 130-foot tall tidal waves. Wow, could you imagine? Those from the much larger Thera cataclysm must have been commensurately greater due to the force of the eruption and the depth of the ocean. So the steeply sloping North Cretan coast, only 62 miles away, home to many Minoan communities, would have been vulnerable to tsunamis. So, a casualty of nature, Akrotiri, the explosion of Thera ranks among the greatest natural disasters since the Ice Age. The stupendous Mount Tambora eruption of 1815 in 1883, which killed tens of thousands and destroyed dozens of communities. And in 1939, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos theorized that the Thera disaster had contributed to the decline of the Minoan civilization after 1500 BC. So most archaeologists greeted this theory with caution until Marinatos discovered Akrotiri, a hurriedly abandoned Minoan settlement buried under volcanic ash at the southeastern corner of Thera. His excavations brought home the dramatic intensity of the eruption. Now Akrotiri has been called the Pompeii of the Aegean, a complete settlement smothered in ash which is preserved for posterity, although here its terrified inhabitants had time to flee. And if you haven't been, Akrotiri is home to a lovely lighthouse, and it's renowned as a spot to get to for, well, the sunsets in Santorini are truly divine, one of a kind, but you can get yourself down to the Akrotiri lighthouse on this tip of the island and sit in front of it over the rocks leading down to the sea and just look out into an uninterrupted view of ocean and the sun setting on it. It's absolutely wonderful. Here's the Thera eruption was preceded by violent earth tremors and showers of volcanic ash, which soon mantled fields and villages on the island. So this is the settlement of Akrotiri, which is deserted, and within a short time the abandoned Minoan village lay under many meters of ash until unearthed by archaeologists, and Akrotiri's homes still stand 2 stories high, their possessions lying where they were abandoned. The closely huddled dwellings offer a vivid picture of Minoan life at the time of the disaster. Well constructed. Here are the plastered walls of the Akrotiri houses, covered with superbly painted friezes of a colourful portrait of village life over 3,500 years ago. There are 2 boxing boys exchanging fisticuffs on a wall, while an elegant antelope prances to the right. Here is more detail from one of the miniature frescoes, which is a scene depicting armed warriors with hide-covering shields, possibly a shipwreck with men falling into the sea. Marinatos unearthed this town that covered more than 13 hectares. Its substantial houses separated by narrow alleyways, just like numerous Greek rural communities to this day. Many still stand over 2 to 3 stories high. Marinatos excavated room after room with great care and unearthed a community frozen at a moment in time. Beds, storage jars, other artifacts lay where they had been abandoned by the fleeing inhabitants. Some of the walls were painted with brilliantly coloured friezes of warriors and towns, ships, animals and plants. Akrotiri was a humble community by Minoan standards, but tells us more of day-to-day life than any Cretan palace. So yes, you can see here an image. So the Thera explosion blew up in the centre of the island, completely, leaving a cone in the centre. So this is the modern-day village in Santorini, and you can see that there used to be an island all around here, but it all just sunk into the sea. That's where I think the legend of Atlantis came from as well, that it was under there. So Marinatos tried to date Akrotiri, and therefore the eruption, based his chronology on ceramic vessels from the houses, which he compared with examples known from the famous Palace of Minos at Knossos in northern Crete. Similar vessels appear in Egyptian sites along the Nile, dated by historical records to about 1500 BC. Marinatos accordingly records to about 1500 BC. I misread that. Marinatos accordingly dated the Cataclysm to around 1450 BC, just the time when Minoan civilization went into decline, and the signs of destruction appear at Knossos. He argued with seemingly good reason that the Thera eruption contributed to the fall of Knossos and the Minoan civilization as a whole, to the Mysians of the Greek mainland. But recent years have witnessed a revolution in our knowledge of ancient climatic fluctuations due to the study of tree ring sequences and deep ice cores, both of which chronicle year by year, decade by decade changes in temperature and rainfall. So some experts claim that the tree rings in ice core data from northern Europe and Greenland reveal cooler temperatures and stunted tree growth over a wide area in 1628 BC, a phenomenon known to be linked to the effects of volcanic ash blocking out sunlight. The same experts believe that this anomaly can be attributed to Thera and the explosion that took place in the 17th century BC, a full century and a half before the final decline of Minoan civilization. However, those who support the Maranatos chronology point out that the climatic anomaly in ice cores and tree ring sequences is from northern Europe and may not reflect the Thera eruption, but an unknown volcanic event 150 years earlier. And another recent discovery compounds the dating mystery. Across the Mediterranean in Egypt's Nile Delta, Austrian scholar Manfred Bietek has discovered pumice in layers dating to around 1550 BC at Tel El Dabba, and this may also be evidence from major volcanic eruption in the eastern Mediterranean, but we still don't know within a century and a half when Thera blew apart. So there can be no question that the Thera disaster had a serious impact on Minoan life, especially on palaces and farming communities living closest to the north coast or in the path of the volcanic ash cloud in eastern Crete. The falling ash would have covered fields of growing crops, killing them, preventing subsequent ploughing. Hundreds, if not thousands, must have perished from famine and from the infectious diseases that are the inevitable consequence of hunger. Knossos itself lies on higher ground, some distance from the sea, so the tidal waves wouldn't have flooded the palace, as they must have communities large and small on the shore. Hundreds of smaller ships and merchant ships, fishing boats, must have been smashed by the tsunamis, with severe effects on long-distance trade in wine and olive oil that nourished Minoan civilization. The cataclysm itself probably didn't destroy the Minoans, who seem to have survived and even prospered for, at a minimum, a few generations after the disaster, and perhaps for much longer. So the fall of Rome, a big topic of course, number 66 here, 5th century AD in the western Mediterranean. Jerome, letter 127 AD, 412. So while these things were taking place in Jerusalem, a dreadful rumour reached us from the west. We heard that Rome was besieged, that the citizens were buying their safety with gold, and that when they had been thus despoiled, they were again beleaguered, so as to lose not only their substance but also their lives. The messenger's voice failed, and sobs interrupted his utterance. The city that had captured the whole world was itself captured. So in the early 5th century, the Roman Empire suffered from major migrations by barbarian peoples, especially in the western provinces, leading to its political dismemberment. And in the course of the 5th century AD occurred that transformation of the Mediterranean world that is commonly termed the fall of Rome. And at the start of the century, the Roman Empire still stretched from Britain to the Sahara, from Spain to the Middle East. By its end, though, Rome's western provinces were in the hands of barbarian kings, while the empire itself was limited to the eastern Mediterranean ruled from Constantinople. The reasons for all this have vexed scholars for centuries, but a number of trends can be discerned. So from a modern perspective, the most striking aspect of the fall of Rome is the emergence of the barbarian kingdoms in the west. A significant catalyst in this process was the arrival in Eastern Europe of the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia during the 370s. So their migration into the regions north of the Black Sea precipitated the collapse of a number of Gothic kingdoms that had thrived on the lower Danube frontier of the Roman Empire since the middle of the 3rd century. And in 376, perhaps hoping to recruit numerous Goths into the Roman army, the Emperor Valens acquiesced in the transportation of large numbers of Gothic refugees across the Danube into Rome's Balkan provinces. Once within the empire, though, they seem to have suffered maltreatment and extortion at the hands of Roman officials, which pushed them into armed revolt. Here's Theodosius I, the emperor who first permitted autonomous communities of barbarians within the empire, and Medallion of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, an example of a new barbarian ruler of the west. So having caused widespread disruption in the Balkans, the Goths confronted Valens and the massed forces of the eastern provinces of Adrianople, which is modern Edirne in European Turkey, on the 9th of August 378. And after a bitter battle, Valens himself and almost 2/3 of his army lay dead. mercy of the Goths. According to the Christian historian Rufinus, writing some 25 years later, the Battle of Adrianople was the beginning of evil times for the Roman Empire thereafter. So in the immediate aftermath, the empire, under the leadership of Theodosius I, was able to contain the problem, but with a significant concession. They undertook to provide troops for the Roman army. The Goths were settled in self-governing communities on Roman land, so this set a precedent for the establishment of autonomous groups of barbarians within the empire's frontiers. Moreover, the continuing relationship between Goths and Romans were hardly harmonious. So aggrieved at their treatment at the hands of Roman commanders, the Gothic leadership made demands for more influential positions in Roman military hierarchy. But they found their ambitions confounded by a combination of imperial vacillation and scheming. In the end, under the leadership of Alaric, the Goths mounted a series of invasions of Italy, culminating in 410 with the sack of Rome. This was the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. So in the course of the 5th century, further migrations of barbarian peoples into the empire, particularly into its western provinces, resulted in its political dismemberment. And on New Year's Eve 406, while imperial forces were distracted by the Gothic assault on Italy, a confederation of tribes crossed the Rhine and made swift progress through the provinces of Gaul and Spain. One of them, the Vandals, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 429, and over the next decade proceeded to conquer the Roman provinces of North Africa. Led by Attila, the Huns broke into the empire anew in the 440s and 50s and wrought considerable destruction in the Balkans, Italy and Gaul. And all the while, the Roman authorities conceded power and territory to the barbarians. In the end, even the heart of the empire succumbed in 476 to the uninspiring Romulus Augustus, the last emperor to rule from Rome. He was deposed by barbarian general Odovacer. By the end of the century, Rome and Italy had been incorporated into the realm of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. So interesting though that to this day they somehow managed to spin these names into negatives, right? Vandals, vandalism, barbarians, barbaric. Have the last laugh, so to speak. So in seeking to understand why these barbarian polities replaced the empire in the west, it's reasonable to look not only to the military strength of the invading barbarians, but also the reasons why the empire was unable to withstand their onslaught. So much has been made of certain structural weaknesses, particularly in terms of inadequate military. Here are the walls of Rome built in the 3rd century and reinforced in the 5th, emblematic of the insecurity of the times, but they weren't enough to protect the city from Alaric's Goths in 410. And the late Roman city with its walls and churches is depicted in the mosaics of Theodoric's the Ostrogoth's church of San Apollinare and Nuevo Ravenna. So, in both cases of poor economic and military resources, the survival of the Roman Empire in the East provides an instructive series of contrasts with the West, and in general the Eastern Empire was less prone to attack from beyond its frontiers than was the West, so it meant that military resources of the emperors at Constantinople were under less sustained pressure than those of their counterparts in the West. Both areas seem to have suffered from a general unwillingness by the empire's inhabitants to provide recruits to the army, but this was bound to have more serious effects on the West, where the exigencies of defence required a more steady supply of manpower. Similarly, the eastern provinces seem to have been better able to provide revenues than those in the West. This will have been because of agricultural life in the East suffered less disruption by invasion than the West, and because the military demands on the Eastern treasury were less severe. Certainly the archaeological evidence suggests that the cities of the East continued to flourish, which itself is an indicator of greater economic wherewithal, in marked contrast to the evidence of the shrieking of cities and the disruption of urban life in the West. It seems that an empire based on a primarily agricultural economy was not able to withstand the demands made on it by a protracted period of crisis and disruption. Matters weren't helped by the lack of a united response to the crisis by different parts of the empire. On the death of Theodosius I in 395, the administration of the empire was divided between East and West, with each half possessing its own imperial court, army, administrative hierarchy, and at best this meant that the eastern and western halves of the empire tended to policies, and at worst could lead to open rivalry between the two imperial courts. Alaric's invasion of Italy, for example, exploited a background of bickering and threats between the eastern and western regimes. So by focusing on the events of the 5th century, it's easy to succumb to the notion that the dismemberment of the Roman Empire in the West was some sort of apocalyptic cataclysm. Yet the changes that occurred between the Gothic migration of 376 and the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 can be seen as a longer process of cultural, political and social transformation that affected the Mediterranean world between the 3rd and 8th centuries. The barbaric invasions that seem so precipitous in the 5th century belonging to a longer process of tribal migration and ethnic change. Major barbarian attacks on the empire's frontiers began in the 2nd century and continued through the 3rd, and moreover new peoples continued to appear on the Eastern Empire's frontiers throughout the 6th century and beyond, right down to the rise of Islam. So likewise, imperial society and culture was itself undergoing a slow metamorphosis, the empire's cities providing a good example. In many places, cities continued to flourish, yet once they had been controlled by pagan aristocrats, they came to be dominated between the 4th and 6th centuries by Christian elites led by bishops. This in turn led to physical changes, as the buildings traditionally associated with urban civilization in the Roman world, such as temples, amphitheatres, theatres and baths, fell into disuse, and instead the civic landscape came to be dominated by churches. In other words, there were significant changes occurring in the Roman Empire independently of those wrought by the advent and invasion of barbarian tribes. I think it's a shame that churches overtook a mass of temples, amphitheatres, theatres and baths. To talk of the fall of Rome is, in a sense, to subscribe to a very narrow view of history that sees things only in terms of what happened to a Roman civilization that's often perceived in idealized and static terms. Roman civilization was dynamic, subject to constant change. In late antiquity, the events associated with the fall of Rome represent a fusion of changes occurring both within the empire and beyond its frontiers. Here we have El Niños and the collapse of the Mocha civilization, 8th century AD on the northern coast of Peru. Walter Alva and Christopher Donner in 1992 state, in Mocha society, tremendous wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few individuals who lived in opulence and were surrounded by lesser nobility. Every valley may have had 1 or 2 royal courts, each having little direct contact with the common people, yet connected to one another like the royalty of Europe. A bad system for the long term. Here the gigantic pyramids of Huaca del Sol ravaged by conquistadors, and El Niños, which stand in the Mocha River Valley. And here is the map showing the sites mentioned in the text. The tint shows the area of Mocha influence. So the Mocha civilization of Peru's north coast flourished between AD 100 and 800 under the rule of authoritarian warrior priests. The Mocha lords never ruled vast domains, just a narrow strip, 250 miles between the Lambayesk Valley in the north and the Nebenia Valley in the south. Their subjects dwelt along the Pacific or in dry river valleys that threaded no more than about 60 miles inland through one of the driest and most inhospitable environments on Earth. The Mocha flourished because of the unique nature of their environment. Their brilliant farming expertise harnessed mountain runoff from the Andes and exploited fertile soils using huge valley irrigation systems capable of producing substantial grain surpluses, and acres of cotton, which they created fine textiles. The floodplains of the Lambayeque, Moche and other coastal valleys formed a green patchwork of closely packed irrigated fields, nourished by long canals. And close offshore, the cold waters of the Humboldt Current in the Pacific caused vigorous upwellings rich in nutrients from the seabed, which millions of anchovies swarmed to feed on. Much of fisherfolk harvested this bounty from reed canoes and dried their catch or ground it into nutritious fish meal. With such ample food supplies, the Moche prospered, ruled by wealthy lords who lived atop the magnificent adobe pyramids. The warrior priests saw themselves as intermediaries between the living and the forces of the spiritual world, and their lives revolved around warfare, ritual and diplomacy, and an endless round of competition for prestige with their fellow leaders. The Moche were seemingly a prosperous people, ruled by invincible lords, but their civilization faltered, then collapsed suddenly, for reasons that are only now being understood. Here, Moche potters were consummate masters of their craft, with a Moche leader adorned with a face paint and ceremonial headdress. Wonderful. The spectacular burials of Moche lords have been found at Siban, and here, a glittering reconstruction, our Lord of Siban wears impressive regalia, and a sceptre, a symbol of power, that is, a stunning dress. So the Quelquia ice cap in the southern Peruvian Andes has preserved a record of rainfall shifts going back well over 1,500 years. The snow record shows how a short drought settled over the Moche region between 534 and 540. I mean, that's 6 years, that's quite a drought to be living through. And between AD 563 and 594, a 30-year drought cycle produced 30% less rainfall, with disastrous results on huge irrigation systems along the north coast. So the Moche capital at Cerro Blanco sprawled around two enormous adobe huacas or pyramids where the warrior priests had their palaces and performed elaborate rituals. The Huaca del Sol rises 135 feet above the plain, 2/3 of the height of the contemporary Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico. As the 6th century droughts intensified, water supplies faltered, water tables and river valleys dropped, crops withered. The lords must have retained firm control by husbanding grain supplies, and there was still fish and fish meal, that is, until El Niño struck. So El Niño, the Christmas child, is a south-flowing countercurrent that appears irregularly off the Peruvian coast as a result of intricate atmospheric ocean interactions in the southwestern Pacific. The influx of warm water alters the normal flows of currents, and the anchovy fishery crashes temporarily. Heavy rains batter the normally arid coast, and torrential floods race down river valleys, carrying everything before them. The effects on a weakened Moche state can be imagined. We do not know the exact years during the long drought when El Niño struck, but when they did, Moche civilization was already in a critical state. Grain supplies were low, irrigation systems depleted, and as the anchovy vanished, torrential rains swamped the Andes and coastal plains. We do not know the exact years during the long drought when El Niño struck, but when they did, Moche civilization was already in a critical state. Grain supplies were low, irrigation systems were depleted, the anchovy vanished, torrential rains swamped the Andes and coastal plains. Surging floods swept everything before them, polluted water supplies, destroyed generations of canals, irrigation works. Muddy water eroded away much of the pyramids, turning them into crater-sized hills. Typhoid, other epidemics must have swept the valley and wiped out entire communities, and infant mortality soared. Thousands starved, for even a full-strength anchovy harvest couldn't feed the entire populace. The Moche lords commissioned new irrigation works, imported more drought-resistant maize strains from neighbours to the east, which appear in archaeological sites dating to soon after the flood. But the facades of their magnificent periods were rebuilt, and for a while the capital regained some of this grandeur. Then a new disaster loomed. Incredibly unlucky, because periodic earthquakes shook the Moche homeland and could send massive amounts of hillside debris into the river valleys. Strong El Niño floods swept the detritus downstream and deposited into the Pacific to be washed up in ridges on the beach. Soon marching dunes crept inland, driven by strong onshore winds, and smothered coastal communities. Then the capital itself, and between AD 550 and 600, Cerro Blanco's warrior priests abandoned their city and moved upstream to the strategic neck of the valley where the Moche River flowed out onto the coastal plain. Now, nothing in earlier Moche history supplied a precedent for this move, which must have come at a time of crisis, when the people may have lost confidence in their leaders. Fixed in a rigid ideological mindset, the Moche rulers seem to have dismissed any thoughts of more flexible approaches to farming. They now settled close to intakes of artificial canals that linked one valley with the next and watered the land nearby. Galindo at the top of the Moche Valley and Pampa Grande in the Laya Bay became large settlements, the latter housing as many as 10 to 12,500 people. Here we have victims sacrificed during an El Niño buried in the melted walls of an adobe plaza. Very sad. The new locations allowed a more conservative approach to water conservation that maximised water use in dry years but made the Mocha even more vulnerable to major floods. So the inevitability of a Greek tragedy, an exceptionally strong El Nino event during the 7th century, washed away many of the field systems around Galindo and Pampa Grande. Another drought came to the north coast that intensified already critical food shortages, and a weakened leadership wrestled with social unrest and highland raids. Around AD 700, the Moche abandoned both settlements, perhaps under duress. Whatever the cause of the final abandonment, repeated droughts and El Nino flooding had broken the back of a wealthy and powerful state. Ultimately, the rigid warrior priests ran out of options, and their spectacular civilization collapsed. I mean, that is one of the most intense series of geographical and natural bad luck, that I think I've ever seen. No wonder it dissolved a grand civilization. Why did Maya civilization collapse? In AD 900, southern Maya lowlands of Central America, the Popol Vuh in the 16th century says, such was the scattering of the work, the human design, the people were ground down, overthrown, the mouths and faces of them destroyed and crushed. Sounds rather brutal. Here's the map of the Mayan homeland with the major centers and sites mentioned in the text. So the ancient Maya of Mesoamerica were among the most flamboyant and longest lived of all pre-Columbian American civilizations. Once humble village farmers, the Maya transformed their low-lying tropical homeland into a landscape of city-states ruled by powerful lords. Between the last few centuries before Christ and AD 900, Maya civilization flourished in the southern lowlands of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Great dynasties of lords presided over aggressive city-states like Copan, Palenque, and Tikal, where they presided as divine rulers, shamans, and intermediaries between the living gods and the ancestors. They thought of themselves as world trees, conduits by which humans communicated with the spiritual world. A Maya lord was far more than a secular ruler. He was a Maya life, linked to his family and to communities large and small by the sacred institution of kingship and its genealogical ties to the revered ancestors. Unfortunately for the Maya, the form of kingship they espoused depended on an agricultural economy that was unsustainable given the environment. So around AD 800, southern lowland Maya civilization abruptly collapsed. The great ceremonial centers of the region were abandoned, huge areas were deserted, never to be reoccupied. In the city of Tikal, the population of 25 to 80,000, because estimates vary, declined to just 1/3 of that, and the survivors were clustered in the ruins of the great pyramids and plazas and tried to retain a semblance of their earlier life. Within a few generations, they were gone. So scholars have long puzzled over the Maya collapse, attributing it to ecological change, social upheaval, political revolution, warfare, among other factors, and it remains one of the great mysteries of the past, even if recent paleoclimatic discoveries have cast drought as one of the major villains. So everyone who studies the Maya collapse agrees that it was brought on by a combination of ecological, political, and social factors. So by AD 800, the population density of the southern lowlands was as high as 200 per square kilometre, over an area so large that it was impossible for hungry farmers to move on to uncleared land. There was simply none left. By the time the collapse came, Maya agricultural production had reached its limits, making people extremely vulnerable to drought. A new generation of theories places much of the blame on short-term climatic change. So here we have Tatiana Proskoriakov's reconstruction of the central precincts of the Maya city of Copan in modern Honduras. Archaeologists have been able to unravel the complex architectural history of the site, and surveys in the city and its hinterland have documented the collapse of its population in the 8th to 9th centuries. Below here is the hero twin Nonapu, patron of scribes, which features in Mayan creation myths as recorded in the Popol Vuh. The hieroglyph of his father, the maize god, appears on the rim of the vessel.
In Maya myth, humankind was fashioned from maize and the crop was essential to the Maya. So the Mayan lowlands are quite unlike the fertile Lehigh Valley or the densely irrigated Moche homeland in Peru, which we covered previously. The Petén Yucatan Peninsula is a vast limestone shelf, poor drainage, a few permanent rivers. The hot and humid lowlands enjoy irregular rainfall, but support dense forests in their primordial state, all of which was cleared by the Maya. The greenery we see today is regenerated forest. So this unforgiving environment had relatively infertile soils that could only be cultivated by clearing and burning off the forest. So the cleared gardens, called milpa, remained fertile for only about 2 years before they were abandoned to lie fallow for up to 7 years. Such fields couldn't possibly support large cities, let alone a dense concentration of villages, so the Maya drained and canalized swamps, turning agricultural useless land into highly productive acreage, as long as there was ample groundwater. And they also grew crops on terraced hillsides, squeezing as much as they could from every acre planted. The Maya farmed complex mosaics of landscapes, but long before the collapse came, their agricultural production was approaching its limits. In the short term, their intensification of farming had worked at the local level, especially when a growing class of rulers and nobles may have exercised close control over production and crop yields through tribute assessments. But they could never standardize agricultural production over wide areas like the Egyptians or the Moche, where large-scale irrigation works made standardization feasible. The Maya environment was highly diverse, with fragile, easily exhausted tropical soils, highly unpredictable rainfall. The farmers faced escalating production demands from their masters at a time when soils were becoming exhausted. Torrential rain falling on cleared land had caused widespread sheet erosion. Firewood was chronically short. A major drought cycle was the knockout blow. So here we have Tikal, one of the greatest of Maya city-states, located in the center of strategic trade routes, and its lords presided over several cities. After 8800, this ceremonial centre rapidly declined. You can imagine it in its heyday, looks wonderful. Here the Maya were superb craftsmen and artists. There's a jade mosaic vase with a portrait head of the maize god, which comes from a late classic burial at Tikal. So an accurate record of changing climatic conditions is preserved in the accumulated layers of sediments at the bottom of the region's lakes. Lake Chichen Canaba in the Yucatan was first filled in about 6,200 BC, at a time when Caribbean sea levels and the local water table rose sharply. Core samples from the lake's sediments show how conditions remained relatively wet until around 1000 BC, when the climate became drier. Drying then continued until it peaked between AD 800 and 1000, the time of the Maya collapse. The drought cycle of these 2 centuries was the most arid period of the past 8,000 years. Lake Punta Laguna in the Quintana Roo area has rapidly accumulating sediments, so much that a core boring yielded a chronology of wet and dry years as accurate as a tree ring sequence. And there were frequent and severe dry spells in AD 585, coinciding with a major drought recorded in the Quelquiar ice core from the Andes that affected the Moche civilization. This drought seems to have caused some disruption to Maya life, but 2 centuries of abundant rainfall, rapid growth ensued. Then a prolonged dry spell settled over the region between AD 725 and 1020, peaking in 862 and 986. The drought ended abruptly in 1020. Within a century, the lake experienced some of the wettest conditions in 8,000 years. So when the great droughts of the 8th and 9th centuries came, Maya civilization was already under increasing stress. The rapidly growing cities were top-heavy with nobility and riven by factionalism. They were importing food from considerable distances away. Competition for military supremacy and prestige placed ever heavier demands on their inhabitants. The droughts were the final straw. Crop yields and tribute payments dwindled rapidly. Powerful lords found their spiritual and secular authority withering in the face of a restless and hungry populace. The combination of drought and environmental damage was beyond the capability of any ruler to endure, and as thousands starved, the survivors abandoned the great cities and dispersed into small hamlets. So here's a small fortified Maya town at Tulam, perching on a low cliff above the Caribbean coast of the northern Yucatan. Maya civilization endured and even prospered in the northern lowlands until the Spanish conquest. So surveys in the hinterland of the city of Copan document the population collapse. So between AD 700 and 850, 20,000 and 25,000 people lived close to or in the city, with the population doubling every 80 to 100 years. And after 850, the urban core lost half its inhabitants, while the rural population increased by almost 20%. After 1150, the population of the Copan Valley was a mere 2,000 to 5,000 people. So the collapse did not come without turmoil and war. To give one example, in AD 645, the rulers of Dos Pilas in present-day northern Guatemala embarked on an ambitious military campaign to expand their territory. Dos Pilas became a wealthy trade center until 761, when its rulers overextended themselves. Nearby Tamarindito attacked its once powerful neighbor and killed the ruler. The surviving nobles fled and built a heavily fortified center atop a craggy hill at Aguateca. Attacked repeatedly, they held on for another half-century before intensive warfare drove them into scattered settlements, which they again fortified. Within their defended areas, with only parched acreage to farm, crop yields must have fallen rapidly, and in one last desperate stand, the surviving Aguatecans created an island fortress on a peninsula on Lake Petexbatun by digging 3 moats across the neck. Even this outpost was abandoned at the height of the drought in the 800s, so the effects of the long dry spells rippled across the Mayan world. Southern lowland civilizations collapsed almost completely, and the center of Maya life shifted to the northern Yucatan, where the water table was closer to the surface. In the south, kingship faltered in the face of drought and rebellious commoners. The elaborate structure of Maya city-states collapsed like a deck of cards within a few generations. Nobody can overcome an empty stomach. What happened to the Anasazi? 13th century AD in the North American Southwest. Tessin Arano in 1995 stated, "People have moved from place to place and have joined and separated again throughout our past, and we have incorporated into our songs, stories and myths, because we must continually remember that without movement there is no life." So the Anasazi were a prehistoric farming people who inhabited the Colorado Plateau and the northern Rio Grande region of the American Southwest between 800 BC and AD 1600. The name Anasazi is an anglicized Navajo word adopted by early archaeologists. It means ancient ones or enemy ancestor. Enemy in this case simply means people who are not ourselves. So Puebloan peoples, the descendants of these early farmers, prefer the term ancestral Puebloan people. I mean, I would as well, to be honest. They're famous for the spectacular cliff dwellings, multi-story stone architecture and rock art that they left behind in places like Canyon de Shelly, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Canyonlands and Bandelier, many of which are now preserved in national parks and monuments in the Four Corners area, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado and Utah. I believe we saw a painting of those in the US National Parks exhibit video. However, these architectural examples represent only the most visible remains of these highly adaptable peoples, who, for in the most part, lived in a small dispersed settlements, tending their gardens of maize, beans and squash, and foraging for wild game and native plants. Here's Betatakin ruin, a cliff dwelling containing 120 rooms and 3 kivas, occupied by people of the Kayenta branch of the Anasazi culture from AD 1250 to 1300. So sub-regional differences in geography, ecological resources, climate and cultural preferences resulted in the evolution of distinct Anasazi sub-traditions, each with its own customs of pottery decoration, masonry styles, architectural forms. Among these sub-traditions of the Anasazi are the Virgin Cayenta, Mesa Verde, Chaco, and Rio Grande branches. At their peak size and distribution in the late 11th century, the combined branches inhabited a vast territory stretching from southern Nevada to central New Mexico and northern Arizona to southern Utah. The Chacoans, whose awe-inspiring community centers were in the San Juan basin of the northwestern New Mexico, were the first of the branches to abandon their ancestral territory in the middle of the 12th century for reasons that are still being debated. But by the end of the 13th century, the Virgin Cayenta and Mesa Verde branch populations abandoned their Four Corners area homes for destinations south and east. Only the Rio Grande branch and isolated communities on the southern margins of the Colorado Plateau continued. By AD 1600, if not by 1450, these Anasazi descendants are known to us as the ancestral Hopi, Zuni, Keres, Tewa, Tiwa, and Towa-speaking Pueblo Indians of contemporary Arizona and New Mexico. The history, movement, and survival of these resilient peoples has fascinated observers for more than 100 years. Archaeologists and Native Americans have different but complementary theories about what encouraged the ancestral Puebloans to leave their homes. Many archaeologists think that the environmental problems drove people from the area. They argue that unfavorable climatic conditions made it impossible to grow enough food for people to survive. Others think that these social problems forced people to leave. Researchers argue that internal conflict, warfare, and fear of violence caused people to build their homes in large aggregated villages or high in the cliffs where they could defend themselves, and later to abandon their homes for more secure places. Yet others think a variety of factors, including new religion, increased safety, and a better climate for growing crops, actually attracted people away from the Four Corners area. So in short, some archaeologists believe that the Anasazi were pushed from the area by difficult conditions. Other archaeologists believe that people were pulled to other areas by attractive conditions. But today, most believe that a combination of environmental and social factors, rather than any single factor, was responsible for the 13th century Anasazi abandonment of the Four Corners area. So environmental problems that would have caused crop failure have been discovered through the study of tree ring growth, ancient plant remains, and food plain stratigraphy. Among these are a 24-year drought at the end of the 13th century, referred to as the Great Drought of AD 1276 to 1299, closely spaced intervals of cold weather in the early to middle 1200s that would have seriously shortened the length of the growing season. A period after AD 1250 when the rains came too late to help the crops grow, and falling water tables at the end of the 1200s. The combination of these factors would have made dry land and floodplain farming risky, if not impossible. Social problems may have come about due to difficult environmental conditions, and these may have included violent competition for the best farmland, raiding for food by people who lacked stored crops, and starvation, illness, and death. Here is Pueblo Bonito, a large community that at its peak stood 4 to 5 stories high, and by its abandonment was estimated that it contained around 600 rooms and 40 kivas, occupied by people of the Chaco branch of the Anasazi culture. And here is Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, containing some 220 rooms and 23 kivas. It was occupied from AD 1250 to 1280 by people of the Mesa Verde branch of the Anasazi culture. Wonderful structures. Amazing. So during the 13th and 14th century, places south and east of the Four Corners area had more reliable snow and rainfall patterns than areas to the north and west. These differences may have contributed to planned migration towards places of high security where friends and relatives were located and where arable land was still available. New religious and social movements have been documented south of the Four Corners area during the 14th century. They include ceremonial and religious organizations and societies, medicine and warfare societies, and new town-sized villages that contain different forms of public architecture and community space. So it's likely that these developments began in the 13th century and may have attracted ancient Pueblo peoples away from their former homelands. So the Puebloan peoples generally do not dispute archaeological explanations. They see the depopulation not as an abandonment, however, but rather as another migration in a continual series of migratory movements that define Pueblo history. According to some oral traditions, the Four Corners area continues to be inhabited by the ancestors, and in addition, the Four Corners area is still visited and used by contemporary Pueblo people for a variety of purposes. Environmental and social factors work together to move people from a less productive and predictable area to an area with greater security and promise. The Anasazi peoples responded to the physical and social environments around them. When conditions changed, they moved on. I suppose that's Occam's razor, simplest solution likely being the right one. And here we have the final mystery. Going to get emotional. It's been such a long journey getting us to this point, the 70th mystery. The catastrophic impacts from outer space, the past 5,000 years, all around the world. A quote from the Book of Revelations. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third of the rivers, and upon the foundation of waters. So fire and brimstone, pestilence, Sodom and Gomorrah, the 7 years of Egyptian famine and the biblical flood. There are many stories of the Lord's vengeance bringing down grief and destruction on those who offended him. Generations of archaeologists and biblical scholars have argued over the historical validity of these disasters, which may in truth be more symbolic than real. Then there are the documented natural cataclysms of the past, the massive Thera eruption that we covered in the previous episode of the second millennium, the great earthquake which overwhelmed the Roman town of Kourion in Cyprus in AD 265, the Mount Tambora eruption of 1815 in Indonesia, which released so much volcanic dust into the atmosphere that 12 months later Europe shivered under the famous year without a summer. Although scientists and historians may argue over the ultimate effects of such disasters, there is no doubt of their existence. Yet some scholars are now posing a new question. Were there, in fact, hitherto undocumented natural catastrophes which changed the course of history? In 1950, Emanuel Velikovsky published his famous Worlds in Collision, in which he argued that the ancient world had suffered from many environmental changes caused by comets hitting the Earth. He carried his argument still further and claimed that the planets Venus and Mars had also caused havoc on Earth during the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. Velikovsky's theories raised such impassioned opposition among scientists that some even tried to have his book banned. His ideas are nonsense, but he did give an accurate description of the destructive meteorite rain which might bombard Earth when a comet passed nearby. Half a century after Worlds in Collision, comets are back in the archaeological news, this time as a result of major advances in the study of ancient climate change. So the paleogeologist Michael Bailey is an expert in tree rings and the climate changes revealed by them over the past 5,000 years. And here are tree ring records showing the annual growth of the trees and thus reflecting the climatic conditions at the time. The first section shows rings around the AD 540 event, and below is the 1141 BC event showing up in 4 sections from the different trees. So Michael points to a particular series of climatic traumas recorded as narrow bands of tree rings in the ancient Irish oaks he studied, but also found in trees from elsewhere around the world. These can be dated to between 2354 and 2345 BC, 1628 and 1623 BC, 1159 and 1141 BC, 208 and 204 BC, and AD 526 and 545. So until recently, such anomalies were all thought to result from the major volcanic eruptions raising ash into the atmosphere, just as the Tambora event did, thus reducing solar radiation and hence causing climatic deterioration and poor tree growth. Volcanic eruptions also leave traces as peaks of acidity and ice cores, which are a record of the annual build-up of layers of compressed snowfall. These layers can be counted and dated, though linking acidity peaks to particular volcanoes is not always certain. Interestingly, no trace of the early 6th century AD episode clearly marked in the tree rings have yet been found as an acidity peak. So having identified such environmental downturns in the tree wings, Bailey enters a complex maze of archaeology, historical records and folklore. He looks at the tree ring evidence in relation to a series of major historical and traditional events. The biblical flood of Genesis, the disasters that befell Egypt at the Exodus, and the famines at the end of King David's reign, a famine in China that ended the Qin dynasty, and finally the tales of Merlin and Arthur and the onset of the Dark Ages in Britain. But could volcanic eruptions alone be responsible for such large-scale and dramatic events? As Bailey asks, is it possible that there is something else in the equation? From descriptions in traditional literature from all over the world, Bailey is led to the conclusion that this something might be cometary impacts or cosmic swarms of cometary debris. So the 1628 anomaly is thought by some to coincide with the Thera eruption in the Aegean that we covered in the last episode. Bailey believes that this in turn could be linked with the breakdown of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt and the Hyksos incursion into the Nile Valley, as well as the biblical Exodus, an event conventionally dated to around 1250 BC. He quotes another author, Ian Wilson, who theorizes that the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night that guided the Israelites was the eruption column from Thera, 500 miles away. Could this, as Bailey suggests, be an eyewitness account of the Thera eruption? He's skating on thin archaeological ice because not all archaeologists agree with the 1628 BC date for the Thera eruption. Long-standing archaeological chronologies based on the cross dates from historical context in Egypt place the disaster at around 1500s BC. But Bailey, in addition, ties in events in other parts of the world as distant as Ireland and China to this 1628 BC episode, again suggesting that circumstantial evidence points to extraterrestrial cometary causes that could have triggered volcanic and other seismic activity. So according to the Bible, 480 years separated the Exodus and the building of King Solomon's temple, when a cloud filled the house of the Lord, and Psalm 18 records the earth shaking and trembling at a time when the foundation of the hills moved and were shaken. The foundations of the earth were discovered at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. Coincidentally, this 480-year gap is very close to the interval between two of Bailey's tree ring events. Bailey believes that the Bible thus records catastrophic and highly significant cometary events that helped create sharp downturns in the eastern Mediterranean world. Bailey takes this further, points out that cometary impacts could have occurred thousands of times during the Earth's existence, but many of them would have been airbursts that would leave no trace in the form of impact craters. Such was the case with the piece of cometary debris that exploded in 1908 about 6 miles above Tunguska in Siberia, with a force of between 12 to 30 megatons, which flattened a huge area of forest. Vague accounts circulated of mysterious sights and sounds, but these might have been dismissed or forgotten had not a curious Russian scientist named Leonid Kulik travelled in search of the location of the explosion and recorded its effects. The disaster left no crater, no trace of this impact has been detected in ice cores, even though we know where to look. Recent researchers using infrasound have revealed the size and frequency of explosions in the atmosphere. Results suggest that the Earth must have been hit by a comet several hundred meters across, or by clusters of smaller fragments at least once, probably several times, over the past 5,000 years. These impacts may not have left visible traces, but Bailey believes some may have wreaked havoc in increasingly densely populated areas. So this is an artist's impression of what the super impact of an asteroid around 500 miles in diameter would look like from space. Absolutely devastating. I mean, that's a world-ending phenomenon, sure, right? And here's the meteor crater in northeast Arizona, United States, which was caused by a meteor impact around 50,000 years ago. So it measures approximately 650 feet deep and 2,625 feet across. It's only relatively recently that it has been recognized as a meteor crater. Not all potentially catastrophic impacts could have left such dramatic evidence. The moment that this happened, just absolute chaos. So tree rings reveal a major major does-fail event in AD 540, which is apparently not the result of a volcanic eruption. Bailey hypothesizes that a comet may have bombarded Earth during the 6th century and triggered a range of natural catastrophes, among them earthquakes, widespread famines, exceptionally cold weather, floods, and an outbreak of plague. These unusual happenings have survived in folk stories for many centuries. The journalist David Keyes pinpoints the year AD 535 to 536 as the crisis point when a catastrophic natural disaster blotted out much solar heat for 18 months, caused climatic anomalies around the world. Unusually heavy rainfall in tropical Africa led to higher rat and flea populations, and thence bubonic plague that spread across the Mediterranean world and Europe in the 6th century, decimating Constantinople. In AD 537 and 538, a severe drought killed numerous Chinese and affected wide areas of the Mongolian steppe, causing widespread population movements across Eurasia, ultimately the creation of an Avar Empire in Eastern Europe and the Western Ukraine. The Avars ultimately came into conflict with the Roman Empire that was suffering because of money shortages, the occupation of the Balkans by Avars and Slavs, the Persian occupation of much of the East, plague, religious dissension. Keyes believes these problems are linked either directly or indirectly to well-documented climatic evidence for abnormally unstable weather in Western Europe between 535 and 555. Keyes argues that a domino effect, triggered by the climatic and epidemiological events of the 6th century, led to the expansion of Anglo-Saxon England, to widespread drought and famine. Across the Atlantic, 6th century drought contributed to the collapse of the great city of Teotihuacan and had major political effects in the Maya lowlands, where the Tikal city-state went into temporary decline. In the Andes, ice cores from the Calquia Glacier document 6th century droughts and El Nino events that decimated Moche civilization along Peru's north coast and helped Tiwanaku by Lake Titicaca in the highlands to rise to prominence. Keyes thinks all of these developments resulted from a massive volcanic eruption in 535 in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, carrying ash and debris as much as 30 miles into the stratosphere and destabilizing human societies around the world. Here he disagrees with Bailey, who places the blame on cometary bombardment. According to Bailey, the debris associated with close passing comets was a major factor in the course of human history. Its combination of climatological data, archaeological evidence, historical records and folklore is at present a purely hypothetical scenario, and unfortunately, scientific proof will be hard to find. For many climatic events leave few traces behind them, but the Bailey hypothesis reminds us that we have much to learn about climatic and natural phenomena which have affected life on Earth and may affect it again in the future. This is a photograph of the devastation caused by that explosion of the cometary debris over Tunguska in Siberia in 1908. So there's no crater, but it just flattened the forest. And of course we have appearances of comets and things like Halley's Comet at the time of the Battle of Hastings and the death of Harold, King of England. It's interesting, isn't it, that this kind of ties it all together, that maybe through many of the stories and mysteries that we've been exploring, comets could have been behind them. Or massive global events like volcanoes could have been behind them all. It just goes to show that no matter how far afield away we are, how different we are as peoples, that ultimately we all live on the same planet, and that home is the same for all of us, and we are at the mercy of it. That concludes what has been a lovely journey. 14 episodes working through the 70 great mysteries of the ancient world, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. I'm going to miss working through this book with you all. If you've enjoyed the series and if you enjoyed the English Gentleman ASMR content, then please do consider subscribing. I'd love to have you on board for future videos. I look forward to having you join me next time.